Um, the other miracle, I don't know if I look at it this way, but my family did. And I'm not saying they're wrong. I just think I can get the nuance in a minute. You know, I've had over 22 or more operations in my lifetime. Initially, most of them to, keep me alive early in life. Um, you're like, well, isn't that miraculous? Somewhat. Um, I give the qualifier, and this is not anything against the divine or, the spirit, because I'm grateful for my life and grateful what I went through. But I also would say I'm fortunate, um, because I had a low lesion, with my spina bifida, because spina bifida means that you have some measure of lack of development along your spinal column. And you either can be born with spina bifida occulta, which means it's covered up, or you actually have a hole in your spine when you're born. So I was not born with the hole in my spine visibly. And those kids, um, they do bring home, because I have encountered them. I'll tell you that story right quick. Um, I encountered them when I was in my 20s. Now, before that, I did go to camp with physically challenged and emotionally disturbed children, but not too many who had my disability. So I didn't deal with any kids with my disability until like I was in my early 20s. And Kirsten, let me tell you, it was mind-opening and mind-blowing because when I met with them, assuming they were, some of them were in wheelchairs, some of them were able-bodied, but in spina bifida affects the full spectrum sometimes one's development, whether dealing with um, math. A lot of those children have trouble with math. Some language because they can get encephalitis. And then other children have limited mobility, if no mobility in their lower half. And so those kids were there, and I went to speak with them. And as I talked about my life, going to college, away from college, or away from home to college, and the questions they asked me, like, you have a girlfriend? You live alone? Um, you you travel alone? It was humbling because I was like, oh, your lives have been completely different. Some measure of that is my physical condition, which I acknowledge as a blessing. Another part of that, though, were my parents. My parents said early on, you can do anything you want to do. You can do whatever you aspire to do. And so I'm grateful for them because it didn't register in my mind I had limits. So is that miraculous? I don't know. I mean, but maybe you might define it. So, I mean, I have another story, but I don't know how much time we have, and I just want to.
No, I have plenty of time. Go for it.
Oh, okay. The more mysterious thing in my life. Now, I mentioned my great grandmother, but she technically wasn't my great grandmother. She technically was my great aunt. But I grew up and was told she was my grandmother and that my great grandmother, and that her daughter was my grandmother. Now, I always suspected that because she was very fair-skinned. Um, she didn't look like my mother. Um, but also my great grandmother was very dark-skinned, so she didn't look like her mother. So it was kind of a weird dynamic. But um, my grandmother, light-skinned, was also married to a light-skinned man, and my mom was a little darker than I am. So it didn't make sense to me. Now you're like, that's not miraculous, Sam, if no one's told you that. I mean, that's just, genetics. No, that's not the miraculous part. But I remember as a child, you said I was precocious. I remember looking at them like, that's not your mother. And them kind of talking me off the limb. Well, long story short, um, I used to have visitors at night in my room, and they were, cloaked, um, and they would come through. And the only way I knew that they were in the room, I lived behind railroad tracks, and when the trains would come by at night, I would see them in our room. I shared a room with my brother. And when they would discover quickly. that I was awake, one of them would come over and they have these long, spindly hands, and they would just go, and I would pass out. Like, okay, so, well, the next thing that happened, this happened over years. Um, I saw a figure who looked like, or who was dressed like my mom, who was fairer skinned, um, lighter eyes. It was confusing because she was really dressed exactly like my mom does at night, like kind of a wrap and, a nightie. And she came in and she had little teeth and she smiled at me. And then she did the same damn thing that those others do and just kind of, you know, waved her hand over my face and I passed out. I told my mother that dream, well, it wasn't a dream, but that vision. And she got real quiet. And she said, when you're older, I'll tell you who that is. And I was like, tell me now. Then I forgot. I was like 7 or 8. I was young. Long story, I'll cut it a little more. I do cut to my family. A lot of my family had moved to Philadelphia, so I went to visit our cousins in Philadelphia when I was 14. And one of my cousins comes through the door who I hadn't met or seen, and she looked like that woman who came to visit me. And I said, Mom, that's her." She's like, "That's your cousin Tina. That's not who you think it is." And I'm like, "She looks like her, right?" But she's like, "No, that wasn't her. You think she came all the way from Philadelphia in the middle of the night and visited you?" No. I was like, "Okay," but that was weird. And I didn't pester her too much because I felt like she wasn't going to tell me anyway. But I was like, "Okay, hi, cousin Tina, looking like that strange woman." Well, my grandmother passed, the one who I thought was my grandmother, and my mother says to me, "Do you remember when you were a young boy and you saw that woman who came to visit me, or came to visit you?" I was like, "Yes, I do." And she looks like cousin Tina. Then she pulled out a photo album and then she opened it to a particular picture I had never seen. And she said, "Was it her?" And it was. And I was like, "Yeah, that was who visited me. Like, who is she?" And she said, "That's my real mother. That's my mother." And I was like, "What happened to her?" She said she died. She hemorrhaged to death while trying to have an abortion, an illegal thing, right? Um, when I was a baby. Not with me, but she was having twins, and so mom was like 1 years old, and um, so she died. And then my mom was sent down to Virginia, where her family is from, initially with her great grandmother, and then the woman who I thought was my grandmother was told to kind of by my real grandmother in a dream to take her in. And so that's what she did in Buffalo. And that's how that happened. So that is one of those things that if I hadn't experienced it, I wouldn't believe it. I'm not a person given to, I don't dismiss ghosts. I don't dismiss stories or remembrance of past lives and things like that. But I don't know if they always work in the order or of the order that we describe. But that I still can't explain because I hadn't seen that woman. I didn't see any pictures of her. No one talked about her, and my mother didn't know her. So it wasn't like she was ever brought up. So that's kind of a more miraculous, mysterious thing.